In 1456, 3,000 exhausted knights and a mob of untrained peasants, armed with farming tools, faced down 60,000 elite Ottoman soldiers, backed by 300 massive cannons. What happened next was so impossible that the Pope ordered church bells to ring at noon for the next 500 years. The Sultan who conquered Constantinople brought 20 times more soldiers to Belgrade, yet somehow lost everything in a single afternoon. This wasn't just a battle for one city. If Belgrade fell, nothing stood between the Ottoman Empire and the heart of Christian Europe. Vienna, Rome, Paris, all would be within reach. July 22nd, 1456. Smoke fills the air, screams echo off crumbling walls, and the impossible is about to unfold. The man who took Constantinople, who broke the 1,000-year Byzantine Empire with massive cannons and tactical genius, stands at Europe's gates with the most powerful army on earth. By the end of this video, you'll understand how a 70-year-old priest, leading farmers with pitchforks, a dying general with his last army, and a tactical mistake that should have been a disaster combined to create the most unlikely military victory in medieval history. You'll discover why setting your own city on fire was the key to victory, how disobeying direct orders from your commanding general saved Europe. The 30-second decision that turned captured cannons into the ultimate reversal. How could the conqueror of Constantinople lose to farmers? How could breaking military discipline lead to victory? What made hardened Ottoman veterans flee from untrained peasants? To understand how farmers defeated an empire, we need to go back 3 years to when Constantinople fell and a young sultan decided he would swallow Europe whole. 1453. Constantinople falls. The last Byzantine emperor dies on the walls as Ottoman soldiers pour through breaches carved by the largest cannons ever built. The city that stood for 1,000 years crumbles in 53 days. The man responsible? Sultan Mehmed II, just 21 years old, already earning the title conqueror. The Ottoman war machine was unlike anything Europe had seen. Janissaries, Christian boys taken as children, converted to Islam, trained from age 7 to be perfect killing machines. They didn't retreat. They didn't surrender. They existed only to expand the empire. Behind them, the Sultan's artillery corps, using gunpowder technology that made castle walls obsolete. Mehmed had proven at Constantinople that no fortress could stand against his cannons. Now he looked northwest. Belgrade. They called it the key to Europe, the white city standing where the Danube meets the Sava River. If Belgrade fell, the Hungarian plains opened like a highway to Vienna, to Rome, to the heart of Christendom. The young Sultan, brilliant and ambitious at 23, saw his destiny clearly. But 2 men stood in his way. John Hunyadi, the White Knight of Christendom. For 20 years, he'd fought the Ottomans and never lost a major battle. A career soldier, practical, brutal when necessary. At 50, he was dying slowly from years of warfare, but his strategic mind remained sharp. Europe's shield, they called him. Then there was John of Capistrano, a 70-year-old Franciscan priest who could move mountains with words. Where Hunyadi relied on steel and tactics, Capistrano wielded faith like a weapon. He'd spent decades walking from village to village, preaching crusade. Peasants dropped their plows to follow him. These 2 Johns despised each other's methods. Hunyadi wanted professional soldiers. Capistrano brought him farmers. Hunyadi planned careful strategy. Capistrano preached divine intervention. Yet fate forced them together, the soldier who knew how to fight, and the priest who could inspire thousands to die smiling. The Ottoman Empire stood at its absolute peak, stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Balkans. The fractured kingdom of Hungary faced them almost alone. King Ladislaus was a boy. The nobility squabbled. Only these 2 old men, one dying of illness, one burning with religious fire, stood between Mehmed and his destiny. When Mehmed's scouts reported back about Belgrade's defences, he laughed. Old walls, a small garrison, a divided leadership. But he didn't know about the 2 Johns and what desperation could forge from their incompatible methods. Mehmed assembled the greatest army of his reign. Conservative estimates put it at 60,000 men, Some sources claim 100,000. The corps was his Janissary corps, 10,000 of the finest infantry in the world. These weren't conscripts or levies. They were professional soldiers who'd trained since childhood. They wore distinctive white caps, carried the latest firearms, and had never fled a battlefield. Supporting them came the Sipahi cavalry, armoured horsemen who'd perfected mobile warfare across 3 continents. Azab irregulars filled out the ranks, light infantry for siege work, engineers, sappers, ammunition carriers, a military machine designed for one purpose, reducing cities to rubble. But the real terror was Mehmed's artillery train, 300 cannons, including monsters that required 60 oxen to pull. The crown jewel was the basilica, a cannon so large it fired stone balls weighing 600 kilograms. When it fired during testing, the sound reportedly killed birds in flight from the concussion alone. Each shot took 3 hours to reload, but one hit could shatter any wall built by human hands. The Ottoman fleet matched this land force, 200 ships to control the Danube, preventing any relief from reaching Belgrade. Galleys, transport barges, and war vessels turned the river into an Ottoman lake. Against this stood Hunyadi's professionals, 10,000 men who'd fought Turks for decades, Hungarian knights in plate armour, Bohemian mercenaries, Serbian auxiliaries who knew the terrain, good soldiers, but exhausted from constant warfare and outnumbered 6-1. Then came Capistrano's crusade. The old priest had walked through Bavaria, Austria, and Hungary, preaching holy war. University students abandoned their studies. Farmers left fields unharvested. Craftsmen dropped their tools. They came with whatever they could carry: pitchforks, axes, hammers, hunting bows. Maybe 40,000 answered the call, but calling them an army was generous. They were a mob united only by faith and Capistrano's burning charisma. Belgrade itself perched where the Danube met the Sava, a perfect strategic position. The upper town held the castle and noble quarters, built on high ground. The lower town spread along the riverbank: merchants, craftsmen, warehouses. Stone walls protected both, but they were old, designed for an age before gunpowder. Hunyadi had done what he could, deepening ditches, reinforcing gates, positioning what few cannons he had. But everyone knew the truth. When the basilica spoke, walls would fall. In early July, Ottoman outriders appeared. Citizens fled with whatever they could carry. Priests held final masses. Soldiers sharpened swords and made peace with God. In the Ottoman camp, engineers assembled the great cannons, while Janissaries performed their ritual preparations: prayer, weapon blessing, mental preparation for the paradise that awaited martyrs. Mehmed sent his traditional ultimatum: surrender and live as subjects, or resist and face annihilation. The messenger returned with a Hungarian arrow through his shoulder, Belgrade's answer. The Sultan nodded. He preferred it this way. Constantinople had taught him that cities taken by storm yielded more glory. As dawn broke on July 4th, the basilica fired its first shot. The stone ball traced a lazy arc through the morning air before smashing into Belgrade's outer wall with the force of an earthquake. The siege had begun. July 4th to 14th became 10 days of hell. The basilica fired every 3 hours, each shot shaking Belgrade to its foundations. Smaller cannons maintained constant bombardment: stone balls, early explosive shells, anything to break the defenders' spirits. By day 3, the outer walls showed gaps. By day 7, entire sections had collapsed into rubble slopes. Inside Belgrade, Hunyadi organized the impossible. Women and children hauled stones to plug breaches. Blacksmiths worked without sleep, forging ammunition. Priests moved among the defenders, offering last rites and absolution. The upper town's walls still stood, but the lower town was dying stone by stone. Each dawn revealed new damage: towers cracked, gates shattered, defensive positions obliterated. The Ottoman engineers worked with methodical precision. They'd learned at Constantinople: concentrate fire on key points, create multiple breaches to divide defenders, use the psychological impact of constant bombardment. Mehmed watched from his silk pavilion, noting weaknesses, planning the final assault. His Janissaries waited with practiced patience. They knew their moment would come, but Hunyadi had fought Ottomans for 20 years. He knew Mehmed's real strength wasn't the army, it was the supply chain. Those 60,000 men needed food, water, ammunition. Everything flowed up the Danube on those 200 ships, cut the river, and the siege would strangle itself. July 14th, Hunyadi unveiled his insane gamble. 40 boats, that's all he had. Fishing vessels, merchant barges, anything that floated. He'd packed them with tar-soaked wood, sulphur, anything flammable. His plan was suicidal: sail directly into the Ottoman fleet, set everything ablaze, and pray. The Hungarians struck at dawn. Ottoman sailors woke to a nightmare. Flaming vessels bearing down on them, Hungarian soldiers leaping between ships with torches and swords. Naval combat on a river is chaos incarnate. No room to maneuver. Current pushing burning wrecks into packed formations, smoke so thick that friend and foe became indistinguishable. For 5 hours, the Danube burned. Hungarian raiders in small boats darted between Ottoman galleys, hurling firepots and boarding where they could. The Ottoman admiral tried to form battle lines, but the river was too narrow, the current too swift. Ships collided, tangled, caught fire from their neighbours. Men in armour drowned by hundreds. Swimming was impossible with steel on your back. What happened next defied every principle of naval warfare. 40 boats shouldn't defeat 200, but fire and current care nothing for numbers. The Ottoman fleet, pride of the empire, became a burning mass drifting downstream. Supply barges exploded as flames reached gunpowder stores. The blockade shattered. In his pavilion, Mehmed received reports with growing disbelief. His perfect siege, his methodical plan, undone by fishing boats and desperate courage. For the first time since Constantinople, something had gone wrong. His rage was terrible, but rage wouldn't rebuild his fleet. The Danube was open. Reinforcements poured into Belgrade, Hunyadi's reserves, fresh crusaders, supplies for the starving defenders. But Mehmed was called conqueror for a reason. Setbacks were lessons, nothing more. He still had overwhelming numbers. His cannons had torn Belgrade's walls to shreds, and his Janissaries remained undefeated. The naval battle was an annoyance. The real test would come when soldiers met in the rubble. The bombardment intensified. Mehmed brought his cannons closer, accepting higher risks for more devastating impacts. By July 20th, the lower town's walls were more gap than stone. Assault ramps of rubble led directly into the city. Both sides knew the final storm was hours away. In Belgrade, Hunyadi and Capistrano held their last council. The soldier wanted organized defense, knights at breach points, coordinated counterattacks. The priest wanted to unleash his crusaders in one massive charge. They agreed on only one thing: Belgrade would not fall without apocalyptic bloodshed. As July 21st dawned, Ottoman drums began their death rhythm. Mehmed raised his personal banner, the signal his men had waited for. But the Sultan had learned from Constantinople. This time, he had a master strategy that would turn Belgrade's geography against itself. Sunset on July 21st painted Belgrade's ruins in blood-red light. As darkness fell, the Ottoman drums changed rhythm, from steady beat to rapid thunder. The Janissaries moved like ghosts through their camp, white caps briefly visible in torchlight before vanishing into darkness. Mehmed's master plan was elegant. Attack at night when defensive fire was least effective, pour through multiple breaches simultaneously, overwhelm the exhausted defenders before they could react. The signal came, Mehmed's personal banner raised high, lit by torches for all to see. 10,000 Janissaries surged forward in disciplined silence, no battle cries, just the soft thunder of boots on rubble. They reached the breaches and began to climb. But here's where Mehmed made his fatal mistake. Hunyadi had anticipated everything. The old general knew night attacks from decades of frontier warfare. Every breach was a trap. As Janissaries climbed rubble slopes, hidden defenders triggered avalanches of stones. Oil-soaked timber, invisible in darkness, burst into flames under the attackers' feet. Hungarian crossbowmen, positioned on surviving wall sections, fired into packed masses below. The night exploded into chaos. Janissaries pressed forward, they didn't know how to retreat. Hungarian knights met them in the gaps, and the greatest infantry of the age clashed with Europe's finest heavy cavalry in spaces so tight that skill mattered less than sheer murderous determination. Steel rang on steel. Men fought blind in smoke and darkness, stabbing at shadows, dying on rubble that shifted with each step. The sensory overload was total. Screams in a dozen languages, gunpowder smoke so thick it burned lungs, the metallic taste of blood in the air. Yet still the Janissaries came, climbing over their own dead, slowly pushing the defenders back through raw numbers and inhuman discipline. By midnight, Ottoman numbers began to tell. A breach near the river gate finally gave way. Janissaries poured through like water through a broken dam. They were in the lower town, and nothing could stop them now. Street by street, house by house, they advanced with methodical precision. Hungarian defenders fell back, trying to form new lines, failing against the tide. The lower town was falling. Hunyadi, watching from the upper castle, made a decision that would echo through military history. If he couldn't hold the lower town, he'd make it worthless. Burn everything. The order spread like the flames that followed. Hungarian soldiers threw torches into buildings, oil into streets. What the Ottomans thought was victory became a trap. What happened next broke every rule of siege warfare. The lower town became an inferno. Janissaries who'd fought so hard to break in now found themselves trapped between advancing flames and defenders who knew every alley. Ottoman reinforcements couldn't get through. Their own success had created a bottleneck of fire and death. The disciplined advance became a desperate fight for survival. Pattern interrupt. You don't burn your own city. But Hunyadi had learned something at previous battles. Ottoman tactics required space to maneuver, clear lines for reinforcement. Turn the battlefield into hell itself, and suddenly farmers with pitchforks could face elite infantry on equal terms. The Janissaries found themselves fighting not just Hungarians but the very city. Walls of flame herding them into killing grounds, smoke so thick that their firearms became useless clubs. Dawn on July 22nd revealed the lower town as a smouldering ruin, Janissaries and defenders alike exhausted from night fighting, but Mehmed had prepared for this. Across the Ottoman lines, massive shapes began moving. Siege towers, each 50 feet tall, packed with fresh troops. These wooden fortresses on wheels had taken weeks to build. Each held 500 men, protected by thick timber and wet hides against fire arrows. The earth shook under their weight as teams of oxen and men hauled them toward Belgrade's walls. From their tops, Ottoman archers could fire down into the city. When they reached the walls, bridges would drop, and fresh troops would pour directly onto the ramparts. It was Constantinople all over again, overwhelming force applied with mechanical precision. But then came the moment that would make generals study this battle for centuries. Hunyadi had saved his few precious cannons for exactly this moment. As the siege towers lumbered into range, Hungarian gunners opened fire with everything they had. The towers, designed to resist arrows and small arms, met concentrated cannon fire. The first tower took a direct hit at its base. The massive structure swayed, tilted, and collapsed in slow motion. 500 men screamed as tons of timber became their tomb. The second tower caught fire despite its wet hides. Hungarian gunners were using heated shot. Men leaped from 50 feet rather than burn, creating more chaos as they landed among advancing infantry. Then Mehmed himself appeared, leading his personal guard toward the largest breach. The Sultan in the breach. His presence electrified the Ottoman army. If their young lord would risk death, how could they do less? The attack surged with renewed fury. This is where physics should have won. Mehmed's appearance rallied 20,000 fresh troops. The Hungarian line bent, cracked, began to crumble. Hunyadi's knights were exhausted, outnumbered beyond hope. In minutes, perhaps less, Belgrade would fall. Then the impossible happened. Capistrano's crusaders, 40,000 peasants who'd been held in reserve, ordered to wait, suddenly surged forward. Against all orders, against military logic, against sanity itself. The 70-year-old priest led them, crucifix held high, his thin voice somehow carrying over the battle's roar. "The Lord fights with us." Hunyadi's first reaction was horror. Untrained peasants charging elite infantry was suicide. But as he watched farmers with pitchforks crash into Janissary lines, he saw something impossible. The Ottomans hesitated. These weren't soldiers fighting by rules they understood. These were madmen who sang hymns while they died, who charged cannons with agricultural tools, who showed no fear because paradise awaited. In that moment of Ottoman confusion, Hunyadi made the decision that would kill him but save Europe. Instead of trying to stop the peasant charge, he supported it. Heavy cavalry, advance. The Hungarian knights, seeing their chance, formed up and charged behind the peasant wave. From the Ottoman perspective, it was insanity made manifest. First came a human tsunami of screaming peasants, completely unpredictable, attacking with suicidal fervor. Then, as Janissary lines tried to adjust, Europe's finest heavy cavalry smashed into them like an iron fist. Discipline versus chaos, and chaos was winning. The Ottoman lines didn't break, they shattered. Janissaries, who had never retreated in their history, found themselves stumbling backward. The peasant charge had done what no professional army could. It had destroyed the rhythm of Ottoman warfare, and behind those peasants came death in steel plate. The retreat became a rout. Crusaders broke through into the Ottoman camp itself, and what they found there changed everything. The Sultan's great cannons sat abandoned, their crews fled. In 17 seconds that would flip the entire battle, Hungarian knights reached the guns. Hunyadi himself was there, shouting orders as soldiers who'd never fired a cannon in their lives turned the massive weapons around. The ultimate reversal, Ottoman guns now pointed at the Ottoman camp. When they fired, the psychological impact was devastating. Soldiers who'd been trying to reform saw their own artillery destroying their own positions. The cry went up, "The cannons are taken." In Ottoman military doctrine, losing your artillery meant total defeat. Then came the moment that ended Ottoman invincibility. Mehmed, still fighting in the breach, took an arrow to the thigh. The young Sultan collapsed, knocked unconscious by pain and blood loss. His bodyguards dragged him away, but the damage was done. The Sultan is dead. The cry spread faster than truth could follow. Mass panic consumed an army that had never known defeat. 60,000 soldiers fled from farmers. Elite Janissaries ran alongside camp followers. The greatest military machine on earth dissolved into a mob seeking only escape. At the river crossings, thousands drowned as panic turned retreat into catastrophe. Ottoman power died that afternoon, crushed between faith and madness on Belgrade's bloody walls. The Sultan's bodyguards carried Mehmed's unconscious form through the chaos. Ottoman soldiers, seeing their lord apparently dead, abandoned everything: weapons, supplies, wounded comrades. The retreat became a stampede toward the boats that remained after Hunyadi's river attack. Men who'd conquered from Baghdad to Athens trampled each other to escape Hungarian farmers. The slaughter that followed was apocalyptic. Crusaders, blood-mad with victory, pursued fleeing Ottomans to the river. Professional soldiers who might have shown mercy were swept along by peasant fury. The Danube ran red, not poetic exaggeration, but literal truth, as thousands died at water's edge. Bodies clogged the fords so thoroughly that later waves of fugitives crossed on corpses of their comrades. By full daylight on July 23rd, the Ottoman camp stood empty except for the dead. The wealth abandoned there defied calculation. Silk pavilions, golden dinner services, the Sultan's personal library, chest after chest of coins meant to pay the army. The great basilica cannon, pride of Ottoman engineering, sat silent amid scattered ammunition. In one afternoon, Belgrade's defenders had won enough plunder to rebuild their ruined city twice over. The statistics tell the scope of catastrophe: 24,000 Ottoman dead against 3,000 defenders lost. The Janissary Corps effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. More Ottoman soldiers died running from Belgrade than had fallen taking Constantinople. Military historians still struggle to explain how disciplined veterans fled from untrained peasants, how the age's greatest army dissolved in hours. When Mehmed woke in a boat fleeing downriver, his first words became Ottoman legend. "I have lost my honour at Belgrade." The young conqueror who'd broken Byzantium wept, not from his wound, but from shame. In one day, he'd gone from destiny's chosen to history's fool, beaten by farmers and a 70-year-old priest. But death wasn't finished with Belgrade. Even as victorious crusaders sang hymns in the ruins, disease spread through the packed city. So many corpses in summer heat, so many wounded without proper care. Plague was inevitable. The soldiers who'd survived Ottoman steel began dying of fever. Hunyadi felt the sickness first. The great general who'd held the frontier for 20 years knew his time was ending. On August 11th, just 3 weeks after his greatest victory, John Hunyadi died. His last meeting with Capistrano saw two enemies reconcile. "You brought the spirit," Hunyadi whispered. "I merely directed it." The priest gave last rites to the soldier who'd saved Christendom. Capistrano followed his rival on October 23rd. The firebrand who'd raised 40,000 with words alone died, still preaching, still calling for crusade. From his deathbed, he blessed the battlefield where impossible victory had bloomed. Two old men who'd found unity only in desperation were gone, but their victory would echo through centuries. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Hungary had no leader of Hunyadi's caliber. The peasant army dispersed to their farms, yet Mehmed, broken by defeat, never returned to Belgrade. The Ottoman expansion into Europe, seemingly unstoppable after Constantinople, ground to a halt. What two dying men had bought with their lives was time. 70 years before the Ottomans would seriously threaten Central Europe again. Belgrade stood. Europe was saved, but the true legacy of that impossible day would echo for centuries. The noon bells began immediately. Pope Calixtus III, receiving word of Belgrade's salvation, ordered every church in Christendom to ring bells at midday. "Let all Christians remember the miracle at Belgrade," he declared. 500 years later, those bells still ring. Most who hear them don't know they commemorate the day farmers beat an empire, but the tradition endures, humanity's longest-running victory celebration. Belgrade marked the high-water point of Ottoman expansion into Europe. Mehmed would conquer elsewhere, Bosnia, parts of Greece, but never with the same confidence. The aura of Ottoman invincibility died in those July flames. European military theorists studied Belgrade obsessively, finding lessons that would shape warfare for centuries. Combined arms tactics, psychological warfare, the power of defensive terrain properly used. But what if Belgrade had fallen? Historical speculation suggests catastrophe. With Belgrade taken, nothing substantial stood between Ottoman armies and Vienna, heart of the Holy Roman Empire. From Vienna, the German plains opened wide. France, struggling in its own wars, couldn't have stopped Ottoman advance. Rome itself might have fallen. The Renaissance, just beginning to flower, would have faced Islamic conquest at its birth. European development, from science to art to exploration, might have taken radically different paths. The military lessons endure. Belgrade proved that technological superiority, those 300 cannons, means nothing without tactical flexibility. It showed that disciplined professionals could be beaten by motivated irregulars in the right circumstances. Most importantly, it demonstrated that when conventional military wisdom says defeat is certain, human courage and desperation can rewrite the rules. Modern military academies still teach Belgrade as the classic upset victory. When underdogs need inspiration, they remember. A dying general and an elderly priest with farmers beat history's most powerful army. David versus Goliath wasn't just Bible story. It happened where the Danube meets the Sava, written in blood and fire and impossible courage. The human element transcends military analysis. When ordinary people, students, farmers, craftsmen, decide to stand against professional killers, extraordinary things become possible. Belgrade reminds us that history's great moments often come not from kings and generals, but from common people choosing to act when action seems insane. Perhaps that's why the bells still ring, not just for military victory but for human potential, for the idea that when everything rational says surrender, something irrational in the human spirit says fight, that farmers with pitchforks can charge cannons, that faith and fury can overcome numbers and steel. So tomorrow at noon, wherever you are, you might hear church bells ring. Now you know, they ring for Belgrade, for two old men who couldn't agree on anything except that Europe must not fall, for peasants who charged when knights hesitated, for the day the impossible became inevitable. They ring to remind us that sometimes history pivots on moments of beautiful insanity, that when reasonable people do unreasonable things for necessary causes, the world changes. Belgrade teaches that lesson still, carved in stone and cannon smoke, written in the blood of farmers who saved a continent. The next time you hear church bells at noon, remember, they ring for the day 3,000 knights and a mob of farmers saved 1,000,000 lives. They ring for Belgrade, where the impossible happened,